Welcome to Considering 828, a live stream of questions of theology and their practical implications. Considering 828 is a live stream of Mile One Mission. For more information about Mile One Mission, you can check us out at mileonemission.ca. And I'm your host, Steve Daw, and this is my brother in Christ, Daniel McKelvie. We're just here together to discuss theology and topics and ideas. As I said, I am Steve Daw. I am an elder at Calvary Baptist Church. Daniel is a member at Calvary Baptist Church, and we are just together to discuss things. I didn't get many questions until like the last minute this week. So for the moment right now, we are just going to pretty much talk about something I found interesting this week. And then you guys, if you want, anybody's watching and wants to put in a chat quote or a question, you can go right ahead and do that, just in case anybody is there. Anyway, Daniel, how are you doing this week?
Well, doing pretty good. Busy, but it's a bit odd. It's a bit odd. I'm like the only person in my office, so it's a little bit eerie. Whereas basically the lights are off, and my little office light is on. It's very, very creepy.
Yeah, that does sound actually kind of really creepy. In any case, good evening. We do have a few people showing up anyway. Yeah, I'm actually stuck at home entirely right now, though it's not because of the COVID thing. I hurt my leg, and so I just stay home.
I'm considered an essential worker, so there you go.
Oh, congratulations. Congratulations. You're far more essential than I am, but normally, to be honest, I would normally be going into an office, but I just am not this week. In any case, the whole COVID thing has been causing a lot of strife in Christian circles, hasn't it?
Yeah, it's been unfortunate. In a lot of ways, I think COVID has been good for the church, but then also it's exposed maybe some of the divisions within the church, which is maybe been, and then some of those divisions have played out in public, which has been maybe less than awesome.
Yeah, there've been a few different things going on about COVID and the way things are going. One of the cause célèbres or celebrated causes, I'm not very good at pronouncing French for linguistic things, has been the whole thing going on with the church in Alberta. James Coates is their pastor. Yeah, they've been in case anybody doesn't know, it happened a couple of weeks ago that James Coates and his church, they decided to continue having services through the COVID restrictions in their area. The local government wanted them to desist because they were meeting in larger numbers than they were supposed to, according to the rules, and they were not wearing masks, and they were totally fine with that. So they weren't actually they weren't doing anything of the requirements for COVID-19 restrictions in the midst of their services. And full disclosure here, the church that I'm part of, we actually are following COVID restrictions. We're down to 5 people in the gathering of 5 people. We're actually separating people out so that they're in 2 different rooms entirely to be able to do the kinds of things for technical stuff. And everybody is masked as often as is possible for what we're doing. So we're actually following the restrictions. So obviously, I have an opinion that these restrictions are, I think, warranted based on the disease that we have. So obviously, but of course, Pastor Coates disagrees. He's completely within his rights to disagree. The difficulty is the government has an opinion too. And they decided that they would arrest him for failing to follow through with an undertaking that the government had placed upon his church to not do this anymore. And then he was arrested. And he turned himself in, fair enough, like standard things. He's following the protocols that way, but he's being held in jail, and he's refusing right now to sign on to the bail conditions, which would require him, until the trial happens, to follow through with the same restrictions, because he believes that part of what he needs to do as a pastor is to meet together in the large groups that they meet in. Is that about right, do you think there, Daniel?
Yeah, I mean, this covers essentially the things. I mean, I guess maybe even as I was saying to you prior to thing. I mean, we probably don't want to get too much into the nitty gritty of what was done, or because I'm always wary of nitpicking a situation. So maybe as we talk about this, we'll start talking about a hypothetical situation very similar to the one we're talking about, and just recognize that we may not have all the facts of the situation completely accurate. And so we want to put that disclaimer out there now that it is possible that we are wrong about the exact nature of why everything was done the way it was done.
Absolutely. And I mean, there could be all sorts of things going on in the background there.
Yes.
I think, though, I mean, based on the facts that we know, I think we can have an opinion about, well, I mean, about what we feel as Christians that we should be doing in these kinds of situations. So what's your opinion on, I mean, Calvary, of course, is following through on the local COVID restrictions, or at least trying to follow them as closely as we can. Some of them are a little vague, so we're not completely sure how to do it, but we're working on it. What is your opinion on the whole thing? Is this a good thing, a bad thing?
I don't think there's anything good to be said about the whole thing in general. In this, and that's for several reasons. I guess it saddens me to see this disagreement playing out in the church. I mean, we're talking about this right now. It's sad that we even have to have this discussion in the first place, that churches are being placed under these restrictions, whether they're warranted or not. It's sad, right? And to be fair, I think it's concerning. Like, even though I would probably say, that I probably would not personally have made the decisions that Pastor Coates did, at least given the information that I have. I do find it concerning the degree to which the government is enforcing this matter and the way they're enforcing it. But then,
I mean,
I think the government too, right? And that's in the sense that, like, I mean, if you make a rule, like, it's like my children, maybe is the best way to put it, right? If I tell my children, if you do this, if you don't do this, if you don't make your bed, then you will go to the corner, right? Then they don't make their bed. Well, if I don't make them go to the corner, then the next time they won't listen to me either, because they're like, well, Daddy didn't mean it. And so I am sympathetic to whether or not it's right or not. I'm still sympathetic to the fact that the government felt they had to, right? And so in general, I don't think there's any winners in this whole situation, to be fair.
Well, and I mean, there's a lot of different things to be teasing apart here. I mean, we talked about this before we went on air, and there's kind of a difference between the question of what we do as Christians and what we do as citizens of Canada. And obviously there are some things that, well, as a citizen of Canada, I have to say there are some troubling things that the government is feeling necessary to do. I mean, normally it's not a good thing to be arresting pastors for issues of conscience. I mean, if you're going to be arresting people for issues of conscience about which generally right-thinking people can disagree over things, then you've kind of the pastors should be the last people you're arresting about that. Like, it's not because they are actually religious figures. I mean, that's what they do.
And this is true not just of pastors, to be fair, too. Like, it gets a bit creepy, too. Like, any religious figure is being arrested by the government.
Absolutely.
From of Canada, it starts to make me feel a little bit weirded out. Right? I mean, you can think on a global scale, like some of the horrible things that are being done in China to the Uyghur Muslims. Like, I probably butchered the pronunciation, right? I mean, it's pretty much genocide, right?
Absolutely.
And so, we can look and be concerned at maybe the precedent. Maybe the worrying part about it is the precedent that it potentially sets, as opposed to the specific act.
Yeah, there was a really good piece in the National Post, I think, last week about this issue. And basically he pointed out that, look, it might actually be acceptable in the sense that, we're dealing with a disease. It is a public health thing, a public safety thing, but we should be concerned when the government overrules the Constitution, That should be a problem for us. Now, of course, that's not a problem for us as Christians. That's a problem for us as people who are Canadians and,
Right.
want to be just and that kind of thing. The
And there's
Uyghur
also
population thing is probably also a Christian thing because, we don't like seeing people suffer for no good reason.
right. I was gonna say too. Also, just you kind of you can even maybe the thing that kind of has stood out to me as a problematic in this pandemic is it has as a culture betrayed, I think, what we value.
Yes, it has.
And the things that we've fought the hardest to keep open have not been the things that I would hope that we would have fought the hardest to keep open.
Oh,
And
so
and
could you
and
explain
so
that a bit?
yeah, so like maybe and it's somewhat understandable, right? Like but you think about something like a church, for example, right?
Right.
Churches have not and Newfoundland things have been pretty good, but like and I recognize that that our leaders have really hard job. Like they're dealing with a lot of different interests yelling in their ears. But you do often get the feel when you're watching this that you know despite the fact that freedom of religion is in the Constitution, it sort of slips down below things like restaurants and so on because those things make money
Right.
and have generate economic value in a sense. And so and it's probably not just churches that this problem occurs for. I notice it more because of churches, but there is certainly like been a focus on certain aspects of our society and making sure that they still function. And part of that is necessary. We need jobs, we need food, put money on the table, money to put food on the table. But
Yeah.
but there is a sense in which it does feel like society's priorities have been laid bare and they're maybe a bit wanting.
Yeah, and I mean that's if we want to get into other situations like that. I mean, I've noticed that generally speaking, for example, plays and artistic expression has had more restriction generally than, say, for example, team sports.
Right.
Um,
That's a great example. That one. Yes, that is true. Right.
yeah, and I mean, there are reasons for that, but I actually kind of think they might not be great reasons.
Right.
Um, Team
Yeah.
sports, and in fact, going back to this most recent outbreak, it was team sports that kind of caused a lot of it.
Yes. Though to be fair, I don't want to put too much the finger because I've been to Costco, I've been around,
Yeah,
I mean I think it's pretty clear that none of us, and when I say none of us, I mean all of us as a whole
right.
province, were really being that careful, and it was inevitable. It just they got unlucky, right? They
Yeah,
were the one that just got it, right? But it could have easily been me having you over for supper. That could have been
right.
it could have just as easily been something like that started it off, right?
It could have been, though. I
No, it
mean,
wasn't.
by a statistic, no, it wasn't. I still have not actually shown any symptoms of COVID for the entirety of the year and a half that we have had the COVID restrictions in
Okay,
place.
there you go.
But of course, it would have been harder for things to happen in instances where there aren't a lot of people getting together. Like,
Yes.
for example, if well, churches do have a very high set of restrictions right now. They
Yeah.
were lower for a while, but honestly, if most of the churches were following it, it would be very, very difficult to actually have community spread in the church.
Yes.
I think it would be much easier in an overcrowded supermarket because
Yes.
some of them
Costco is
were.
particularly bad.
Well, at different times. I
At
mean,
different times, depending on the time you go. Yes.
yeah, yeah, and I mean that's neither here nor there. I don't want to come down on one specific retail thing, but again, what you were saying, retail tended to be of more higher value because of the economic benefit that it brings than, say, for example, other things that were not quite so economically noticeable.
Yes.
Um, so it was like the economics tended to be more valuable as a society than, say, artistic things. Similarly, from the church perspective, it does seem like there is a situation where some people would seem to think that things like sports or retail were more important than having church, or restaurants were more important than having church.
Yeah. I think that
Now,
we can say.
yeah, but I mean, the problem that I'm going to have there is that I'm not really sure that was a problem that COVID or the government caused,
No.
as much as it's the restrictions that the government is placing based on COVID show. The fact is, I had a problem before this whole COVID thing happened when, to be honest, the majority of Christians would call themselves regular attenders if they showed up about 25 to 50% of the time.
Right.
And that not 25 to 50% of the time that the church building is open. I mean, like 25 to 50% of the weekly services
Right.
that a church would have. And, that people would miss church for all sorts of reasons, like, I don't know, brunch, or sports for my kids, or all sorts of interesting things. And that's going to change not only the way that the society sees the church as valuable, but also the way individuals see the church as valuable. Which is going back to the whole Coates thing. James Coates, I think that's where I kind of agree with him pretty heavily. I think that meeting together as a church body is really, really important.
And it's mandated in the scripture too. It's mandated. We can get into but the scripture does mandate us gathering together.
Absolutely.
And so this is why part of the thorny issue of it comes is this question of when should we as a Christian decide that, okay, the government, I have to break the law in order to continue to be faithful as a Christian.
Right.
And that is a very difficult question.
Yeah. And of course, it's not going to be as easy as, a big, the easy cases would be, easy to talk about. Everybody would agree about it. But this kind of thing that we're dealing with the COVID restrictions, well, it's a little bit more of a question. I mean, is it too few people to have 30% of your church building, or 10%? I mean, the restrictions are different in different places.
And it might depend on the church too, because saying you can only have 20% of your build, let's say we just stick an arbitrary cap on building capacity. That's our one restriction, right?
Right.
That affects some churches differently than other churches.
Yeah.
And like if you're a mega church, or if we put hard caps on things, we say, you can't have more than 100 people. That affects like a mega church far more than it affects a small church, right?
Yeah.
We were getting to the point now, it was getting hit in it, but like pre-lockdown happened again. For a while there, pretty much if you wanted to come to church at Calvary, you could come. There was room. Yep. We could fit within the restrictions. Now there was a few weeks towards the end where we started to bump up against that cap, and people had to but in general, you could come, especially if you were kind of a little bit on the ball and registered ahead of time. You could come to church if you wanted to.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, it doesn't affect a church like Calvary as much anyway. Our membership is, at the height of our attendance, our average attendance was about 114. So 100 isn't actually that much of a restriction. Now, take one of the churches in the city that has an average Sunday attendance of 500, and
that's a big problem.
Absolutely. 100 would be like one-fifth of their total congregation. So that's a much larger restriction for them.
I think for me, it comes down to, and we talked about this, Steve, I think before, but when people talk about, when we look at the biblical side of whether or not something, like from a biblically immoral or unjust law or restriction that is placed upon the church, there's really two ways of looking at it. Because we've got the biblical ones. Maybe I should roll back and say we've got unbiblical reasons for not wanting things and then we got biblical ones, right? And when I say unbiblical ones, I don't mean wrong, right? Per se, right? In the sense that I just mean that I don't know, raising minimum wage, just for example. That's a very foreign question. You will find lots of studies telling you that raising the minimum wage is good for society, and lots of studies showing that raising the minimum wage is bad for society. People disagree greatly over this question, right? And
it's possible we disagree about this question.
Right, it's possible we disagree about this question. I haven't asked you, right? But and this is the problem is and there's lots of evidence to argue, and people could even come from the same moral position and disagree about the answer to that question, right? Because it's a question of policy. Absolutely. But then on the other hand, there are things that the Bible actually speaks to, such as the gathering of believers. Mm-hmm. Right? So we are morally mandated to gather together, right?
Absolutely.
But then the government has rules now. Now they always have had some rules, but they've been relatively light-handed. But the government now has rules around that restrict our ability to do that. But this is also true of many other things, and it's the degree of the restriction that starts to kind of get to this thorny issue. Because, for example, another one is, the church pays you, Steve, and and we are mandated in Scripture to make sure that those who labor in teaching and preaching, get taken care of, that we compensate you, so to speak, for the fact that you have dedicated yourself to the work of the ministry.
Right.
Now, the government's rules around issuing tax receipts and taking taxes off the thing, they make that more difficult because it costs us more money to pay you. We've got to make sure that we've done all our accounting properly. Actually, just even being a charity, we've got to do all this stuff to make sure. Right? These are all rules that make that fulfilling that biblical mandate to take care of you, to make sure that you are financially provided for, more difficult. But no, I don't think anyone is arguing that was wrong. That's wrong or unnecessarily restrictive or anything like that. So the degree of restriction matters, I think, right? Right. And whether the question is, does it actually prevent you from doing what you're talking about, or is it just making it more difficult to do it the way you would like?
Right. And that, I think, is going to be where the crux of the issue comes to with these whole COVID restrictions things. Is it actually something that is something that's required by the situation we're in, and the restrictions are as limited as they can be given the restrictions we're in, at which point we really don't have a lot to complain about. But
Right.
if the restrictions start to be more onerous than are valid for the situation we're in, I mean, and unfortunately, there are all sorts of ways that this can happen. I mean, let's face it, China does tell you that they have freedom of religion. It's just that they put a heck of a lot of restrictions on that, on what they will call religion that is acceptable to them. I mean, that's why they have state churches and not state churches.
Yeah.
I mean,
as long as you pay homage to Caesar, you're good.
Yeah, which Christians tend to have a problem with.
Right. And that's, but I guess that gets to that question, Steve, of there's two, something could be unjust.
Yeah.
But because something can be unjust, and yet I still don't think, because I guess coming back to that, we as Christians are mandated to fight it, so to speak, to civilly disobey, or to give you an example. I mean, let's say at some point the Canadian government decides that we're no longer going to let charities that disagree on social issues from us be charities.
Right.
So that would be unjust, right?
Yes.
That would be an example of injustice, and we could argue in the courts and stand up and say, this is unjust, as long as we're doing this in a godly and kind manner, right? But I don't think that implies that we should now stop paying taxes to the government.
No, and I would agree with that.
Right, and so or to stop filing the forms that they require. So the even though there was an injustice, this hasn't happened. This is just a theoretical situation, right? All right. So even though there's this injustice that's perpetuated, it doesn't necessarily. It might make ministry more difficult because things are going to get more expensive. Maybe in some ways it makes it easier because you don't have to fill as much paperwork because you don't actually technically exist. Right, but so even though there's this injustice that's been perpetrated, it still doesn't necessitate that we stand up and say we're going to break the law because and that's where I think the difficulty with these things are. And there are some things I think when I look at these, look, because this is played out in a bunch of churches, not just this church. It's even played out within our congregation. This there are people who within our congregation who run the whole gambit on their views on these issues, right? And you've got some things, I think, which maybe if I can pick a few examples, there are some things which I think biblically we don't really have a choice on, in the sense that, mask wearing I'll pick. If the government mandates that we wear masks, there is nowhere in the Bible that it says that thou shalt not wear a mask. And there is no sense in which it infringes on our ability to get together. Yes, it's uncomfortable. Yes, it sucks. Yes, it's no fun. And no one wants to wear a mask, right? But I don't think you can make any credible biblical argument that mask wearing infringes upon our ability to be Christians.
I think it would be very difficult, but
yes, it'd be very difficult to do that, right? However, when we come to the question of how many people should gather together, how long is too long? So you could say an emergency situation. Let's say tomorrow there's actually think Snowmageddon, right?
yep.
Snowmageddon, we didn't have church during Snowmageddon, and no one complained because clearly it is an emergency. We can't get out on the roads. It's not really possible. It's like no one cares that church didn't happen for a week or 2 weeks. It's 2 Sundays I think we missed.
It was 2
it?
Sundays, yeah.
2 Sundays we missed, right? So no one particularly thinks that's a big problem that we missed 2 Sundays. But if that goes on for a year, like we're talking now,
yeah,
that's when those questions become more complicated. And maybe my best way to say this is even though I am comfortable with our position as a church, I understand why Christians might feel that restrictions such as the ones that we currently face at the moment, where you only can do streaming basically, are untenable. And they're not in keeping with Scripture. And even though I don't think that we're quite at that point yet, I do understand that maybe Christians can have a moral view on that part, right. Even though I don't think you can for example, I just use the mask wearing as an example too. That I don't think there's a moral question to be had there. That's just submit to the government.
So it's on the gradation anyway. I mean, where I would disagree with Pastor Coates isn't that he's wrong about saying that there would be a level at which these restrictions become too onerous for churches and we're going to have to disobey. I agree with him there. I just would disagree that we've reached that point.
Right. Yeah. And that's maybe the question, because this is very gray. We could think of the classic example of, I don't know, hiding people from genocide, like you mentioned to me, right? Right. Like that, clearly, we should, we as Christians should disobey the law, right? If the law says that, I don't know, all Black people need to be put in concentration camps, then, we should disobey that law. Right?
And vociferously.
Right. And we should fight that law. Like we should, do what it takes to hide people who are being oppressed in that manner. Right. So in that sense, I think but situations are rarely that clear. They usually are much more gray, and you get these current example where the line at which everyone thinks we've crossed that point is very difficult to determine. And
of course, there's that line is going to move depending on different situations too. I mean, we were discussing the question of medical licensing and, say, for example, medical assistance in dying or euthanasia or abortion. I mean, can doctors right now have a conscience protection? Will they always? I don't know. And I mean, at some point, there's going to be a injustice there. Though I think there's something else too that I'm kind of worried about when it comes to the church as well. And that's that we're protesting for ourselves here.
Yes.
I worry sometimes that we're actually not well known for, going against injustices when they're injustices against people that aren't us. Now, there are of course exceptions. I remember back when I was in law school, there was an instance where there was a guy who was beaten up for being homosexual, and as a result, a bunch of people marched. And I do know some Christian friends of mine who marched to protest, somebody not actually getting arrested for assault, because apparently the guy deserved it. I guess I don't know, but that was an injustice that
the guy deserved it.
No, the guy did not deserve it, because you don't deserve assault. I'm sorry.
No. I just want to clear that up just before anyone.
Right. We're in a Western society. Adults don't beat each other up. It's just not a thing. And if you do it, you should get arrested. That's just a normal thing. If 3 guys beat up on 1 guy, you should always be arrested for that.
Yes. But
there have been instances where there have been injustices happening, and I was in a small town at the time, and that kind of thing. Christians should have stood up for that, and I was happy that some did. Um, but unfortunately, that's not what we're known for usually. We do get a lot of press for standing up for ourselves. Now, that said, there are lots of instances where we do that. I can remember there's a lot of cases where you'll get if you again, I did law school a long time ago, so you'll hear with these things where friends of the court will give an amicus brief in favor of a case. And there have been a lot of instances where Christian legal associations have given amicus briefs in support of Muslims, Buddhists, Jews, sometimes even atheists, depending on what the law situation was. And if they saw it as an injustice, there are ministries who would fight against that. And that's a good thing. I just think we as a church need to be more about that.
Yes. Yes, well, a lot of the times when you look at in the Bible too, when it talks about standing up and fighting for justice, and so like we're not talking about justice for ourselves.
No.
Right? Like Christian civil disobedience when the injustice is leveled at us looks very humble and quiet, and you just take what the consequences of your actions. Now, and so there is a sense in that we don't fight enough for the injustices around us, right? I mean, we should do this not even just because it's good for us to it's just because biblically we should be people. I mean, you think about through history, some of the great Christian leaders we think of through history who fought injustice, right? And I mean, you think about the slave trade, right? And how that was abolished. The irony, actually, probably of the slave trade, the sad part of it, it was fought against by a bunch of Christians, while a bunch of other Christians tried to justify it.
In a lot of cases, yeah.
And it's maybe this is the whole thing here is that it feels maybe we're fighting the wrong battle, especially considering the depth of the darkness in our country.
Yeah, and while we're watching this happen, I mean, just on other notes, our government is allowing for example, medical assistance in dying for people who only have, well, the Senate have said medical assistance in dying for people whose only thing is a psychological disorder. So, for example, your depression can actually get you validated to get medical assistance in dying if the law follows through with what the Senate has put forward for a possible law.
And that's justice.
It is. Or even a more extreme injustice for disability. I mean, to tell somebody who's disabled that, well, you can get medical assistance in dying for that. How is that different from our society telling them that, well, you're less deserving of life than somebody else?
And that does make for a bit of a question too, because there's several levels to that injustice too, in the sense that society doesn't take care of these people, or it doesn't. And that it's just
a mess.
It's a mess. It really is. And I think that we as Christians, we should care about these issues more than we do.
Yeah, and I think we should probably care a lot more thoughtfully than we do. Because I mean, the fact is, there is an awful lot of things that are going on in the background, and it would be easy if we could just simply say, "Well, this is obviously right, and this is obviously wrong." But we have a lot of things that we have to deal with there. There is a need to be compassionate for people. There is a need to be able to help other people, and there is a problem if we as a society don't help the least among us. And it's pretty bad that we've gotten to the point where, the society is actually getting to the point where we would say that, death would be actually more preferable to learning to deal with people in more positive ways, more constructive ways.
Yes, and I mean, I guess we're not going to solve all these issues here tonight, because many of these issues are very complex. They involve a lot of injustices on so many different levels. And
absolutely.
But I guess maybe if I was kind of summarize go back to kind of looking at the Pastor Coates thing, it really does come down to I'm not sure that anyone wins
No.
out of this, and it is really unfortunate that. Oh, here I got my cord. I was about to lose the battery. It is really unfortunate that we maybe as Christians have picked this hill to die on.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I also have a lot of sympathy for the families involved, because we have a father and a husband who is not with his family now. He's in jail and they can't see him, and he is doing that. Like, I don't know the man, but I presume because he genuinely believes that he is following God's will in this matter, and whether or not he is right to do that, that he whether or not that is warranted by the Bible and stuff like that. I think we as Christians should also be careful before we throw too much flack at him as well, because I was just thinking, we as Christians are meant to be known by our love for one another. And sometimes it seems that we in the church spend more time attacking one another for our minor differences than we do, celebrating, the one thing we do have in common, which is Christ.
Right. And I mean, for that point, let's be totally clear. We do not think that Pastor Coates is a heretic or anything like that. We don't think that he's unchristian. I actually pray for the man, and I think Christians should. I'm just not sure that the situation is. And of course, this goes back to something else. We're Christians. We know that everybody's sinful. So we know that everybody, I mean, if you want to look for ways that somebody's wrong, it won't be hard to find. It's always true. There are no angels on this in humanity.
Yes.
So.
Yeah. And maybe, so I guess, that would be my takeaway, is that, we should pray, and we should pray that God would use this for his glory, and use this to grow his church.
Absolutely.
Even if I think this is an unwise choice of action, or at least based upon my understanding of the circumstances, I think this is an unwise choice of action. But that doesn't mean that that we can't pray that God would use this and redeem this for his glory, and that when we come out of this, pray that the church can come together and heal. I mean, I think about one thing that's always struck me is you think back, and you read about this in church history, the difficulties this caused was. So the Roman Empire persecuted Christians for a long time and was killing them all. Off and on for a bit, right? But then there came a point when Christianity stopped being persecuted and became basically state religion, right? Right? And, you think about, what about the people who, the Christians who didn't fully stand up for the gospel in that time period? Like they avoided being eaten by the lions because they paid slight lip service to Caesar.
Yeah.
Right? Like, how do you reconcile that if you come out of that and your whole family was killed, standing up for the gospel, and then this other dude standing there beside you and saying, and he did fine because he didn't do anything risky.
And let's be honest, that caused a lot of trouble within the church. Read about the Donatist controversy sometime.
So I think that's, we need to this is not the first time the church has faced this sort of issue. And so maybe that should be the comfort in all this, is that we don't, that God is working, and just like he was working back then, he's working now, and we don't understand it, but there is, I think the key is that we need to find a way to forgive and move on and come together as the church.
Yeah.
As this thing.
And of course, this is kind of central to recognizing that God is, in fact, in control. I mean, the morning devotions that I do, I'm going through Romans 8 right now, and Romans 8:28 and 29 are pretty clear about this. God is still in control. He will use this for his glory. The only question is going to be whether it's going to be for our good as we love and serve the Lord and are called according to his purposes. And so I think that's what we need to be, a people who focus more on following God and then be faithful in the midst of it, and pray that God use it, because he will.
Yeah, and I think, and we, as long as we're faithful and we continue to press forward and trust that God is working, and be humble about how we do that too, right?
Absolutely.
And recognizing that we might not actually understand things, because here's the thing: at the end of the day, you and me might be wrong about this
Absolutely.
issue, right? And you know, maybe restriction is just the precursor to the government enacting all sorts of restrictions of the church. I don't think so, but
Hey,
maybe we just didn't see it. Um, but I think, as we pursue this, let's pray for each other, and let's encourage one another as Christians, um, and try to speak civilly, at the very least speak civilly to each other.
though we should
Because
probably speak civilly to
a lot of
everyone.
nasty stuff on the internet between Christians regarding this issue, and it does make me very sad on both sides. Like, the nasty stuff is not limited to one side of the issue. Let me be clear. Like, there's plenty of people saying nasty things on both sides, and it makes me sad.
And it should. In any case, I think we're actually over time. I try to keep these things to half an hour, and now it's 40 minutes. So, in any case, I just wanted to say thanks for joining me this week, Daniel. Again, anybody who is in the chat right now, just to let you know, we will be doing something like this again next week. I am going to be answering questions next week too. So if you want to join in and do that, you can drop me a line with a few questions. I've got a whole bunch of them now, because when I said I didn't have any questions, people for some reason sent me a whole bunch of them well before I actually had time to deal with it. So I'll have lots of stuff to deal with next week.
And you got the guest on with you.
Yes, I will be having John Troke with me next week, and I don't know. I tend, this is a hobby for me, so I tend to put these things together over time. So we'll see what happens. In any case, thank you for joining me, Daniel. Thank you for joining us, everyone out there, and God bless. And again, big takeaway for this one: let's just be faithful Christians in the midst of all of this. It's going to include being loving for one another, and even for those who disagree with us, especially if they claim the name of Christ. Anyway, God bless.
Bye.